Hi, Jamie.
Good morning.
How are you?
Oh, refreshed after quite a week of writing and professional stuff and whatnot. It's nice to see your face and have our chit chat on this morning. So I always look forward to it.
Same here, very much so. And I think reading your essays this week, the sort of the thing that I wondered if we could maybe explore a bit is thinking about education, about how Gestalt processing, including language, including English, kind of, you know, is within education because you've written some really interesting pieces this week that have kind of just triggered lots of thoughts in
Oh,
terms of many aspects of school, curriculum, whatever you want to call it. Um, so, what are your thoughts on how a Gestalt processor not only is a as a teacher, but as a student, bringing it from both angles, I guess.
aye. So I tend to focus on the relationships,
Hmm.
right? I don't approach my students, my own children, from a standpoint of scores and grades and all of that kind of stuff. Because to me, it's so arbitrary, it's so kind of made up.
Hmm.
I want to build a relationship with a student. I want to get to know them, how their brain works. And of course, I do all the science stuff. I have all of their data and their IEPs and their psycho-aid reports and their academic reports. And I wrote about that a couple of weeks ago about how I kind of like the decoder ring of how to find GLPs in the data because there's no test for us, right? There's no blood test or whatever, or
Mm.
however the DSM works. So, once I've identified them, now what? Right. And it begins with relationship to get to know them, to get to know their scripts, to get to know their mind space and so on. But also a firm knowledge of the educational landscape that we all exist in, my job as a professional, their job as a student, all of these kinds of crazy discussions. And I cannot talk to a student, I kind of mentor them from a standpoint of authority. I really cannot because children are very slippery. They find ways around things and they find a way to do the things that they want to do. Like we talk about autistic special interests and stuff. They find a way to accomplish that. And so I want to know, not to kind of negate that or extinguish that, but I want to know what makes them happy. I want to know what they would prefer to do.
Mm.
Then, from within that standpoint, I can tailor a curriculum for them. And I wrote a bit about it, my study in holistic language instruction, where I went into the classroom, not my classroom, but a colleague's classroom, and I did an intervention period, 20 minutes a day, once a week. And I wanted to prove to management that my methods work. And in building a relationship and in creating that relational field in the classroom with the students, and not just ones with IEPs, but everyone. Everyone who participated, their scores increased by over 30%, from
Wow.
test administration to test administration. So I've proven to myself that it works, and I've released the data to the school I was working with and so on. And they were mildly interested, but there's no commercial viability to a relationship, right? You cannot sell a product into that. And so I just kind of set about to do that as my practice, right, of creating these relational fields between myself and the classes, myself and students.
Mm.
And last year, noticing the pattern that students, Gestalt processors especially, were failing the upper algebra class. I went into the classroom with them and created that field with them, and they all passed. Where the year before, everybody with an IEP, bar one, failed that class.
Yeah.
The following year, with me, creating relationship, creating structure, creating story around what needed to be done with, advanced trigonometry, pre-calculus stuff, everyone passed. And they didn't just squeak by either. Some of them did spectacularly well and went on to calculus and so on with those kinds of things in mind. But what I've been writing about this week is building classroom spaces, learning spaces for coherence, and
Yeah.
what that might look like. So I think that the word of the week is coherence.
Mm. And what does it look like? What would you, if you were giving me advice? I'm a newly qualified teacher. I desperately want to get things right for the children that I'm working who've got, we might say in the UK, my plans. In the US, we would say IEPs, or we might call them education and healthcare plans. I'm new, I'm fresh, I really desperately want to support these students, but my mind is still very analytical and it wants shape and structure. What would your advice be to me?
But I think from my standpoint, and not just from like heritage and
Mm,
background and stuff, what you cannot have a relationship professionally without relationship. You have to
yeah,
know the person. You have to be friendly with them, and I think about that across all the relationships I have, whether they're the professional relationships or whatever. The ones that operate the best, they're really friendships, right?
mm,
And I don't suppose that, myself at my age and professional responsibility are like besties with my
no,
students. But we're friends, right? We know each other. We know family. We know, oh, you have a new girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever. Highs and lows. And, they can come to me at whatever. If the door is open, they're welcome in my place. If they want a cup of tea, a sweet or something, help yourself,
mm,
You have to have a relationship. They have to feel safe. They have to have that the beginnings, at least, of attunement. There has to be a coherence between the things that I say and the things that I do, right? So that
yeah,
relational field, that frequency space, it has to be, the harmonic has to be true. It cannot be all distorted, right? So I kind of say one thing and do another, right? I have to be who I am,
yeah,
and I have to be that way towards my colleagues, towards my superiors, and towards the children. And when my colleagues and superiors are wrong, I defend the children. When my children are wrong, I let them know this is what happened. This is why we're doing this. Um, so from that standpoint, I think the relational field is best. And I think I've heard you describe it a few times where you came in contact first with these children that were different. And rather than, put the guardrails on and steer them into, what you thought professionally was where they should be,
mm,
you kind of took a step back, kind of noticed the patterns, learned about them, formed a relationship with them, started doing your own professional development about what is this thing that I'm seeing. And then that led you to meet people and grow your practice and so on. And as teachers, we have to do the same thing, you know.
yeah.
And I don't think it's like I'm old and most teachers are young or anything like that. I think
No, no.
I am used to being friends. Teresa and I, my wife, we're besties. We always have been. We started that way. And that's what makes it work for so long. I'm trying my hardest to be friends with my children as much as I can with teenagers and stuff. But I think, that I've tried to organize my life in the last 5 years so that I'm home more, so that I can be friends and
Mm,
take part and stuff and make an effort, even though, I'm away from home for teaching and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not filthy rich and I can't stay home all day, but to the extent I can, I want to lead with relationship and friendship.
yeah.
Um, and so like family wise, we had a conversation about, I'm not really comfortable anymore with these kinds of, parent-child terms. And, if it were up to you, the kids, what would you prefer? You can call me Jamie if you like, something silly like parental unit or something like that. But, I don't want to be so hung up on this, mother, etc., to say, oh my goodness, if you didn't call me that, how informal of you to call me Jamie or whatever. Um, I want to kind of evolve that relationship. And I do the same thing with the children,
Mm,
at school. It's whatever makes you comfortable. I don't care. You can call me
mm,
Dr. H, you can call me Dr. Horrocks, you can call me Doc, right? If you called me Jamie, I wouldn't upset. I know some of my colleagues are very kind of extra about that, but I'm not really.
mm.
Um, I want the relationship to happen. And then
Mm,
once that relational trust is there, then they can feel safe to grow, right? They can
yeah.
take risks, they can try when they feel safe. And I think that's what I've been on about, creating that space.
And that goes literally from, you're talking about students who are teenagers, I guess, in the main, yeah. And that's exactly the same with the younger. I mean, I work with literally sort of 2, 3 year old children all the way up to young people who are 18 or 19. And it's just the same. It might look different how you look at for attunement. But for me, and reading some of your essays this week, I feel like it's attunement is seeing that person as a whole. And that connection is seeing them as a whole. And then you can, so that means what's intrinsically motivating for them, what's their safe space, their safe place, what they enjoy, what they really don't like. About their lives, things that are important to them. Um, and that is the same through every stage of every age.
Well, and I know, kind of that no place for autism theme came
Hmm.
out of my induction into teaching and my onboarding onto the job and so on. That is really didn't see a place for me. So it wasn't an ironic title or anything like that. Um, but when I do these deep dives on the data, when I get a new case, when I meet a new student and I want to know what makes them tick, because I'm not a behaviorist, right? I'm not looking for the things that they enjoy so I can withhold them in order to
Mm,
get them, trained into my methodology. But I do a very deep dive and I've got an impeccable record of, for the next meeting with parents to, kind of my way of doing things. I script everything, of course. And I, for an initial IEP meeting that I'm having with parents, is probably 21 pages of script and data and stuff all written down so that I can have a conversation, I can support myself. And if my brain gets all jumbled and I get all excited about things, I have everything on paper, I can refer to it, right? But at the same time, I'm narrating that reality to them, right? I introduce myself as autistic, as a Gestalt processor, and I recognize their shock that an old person can be autistic, that an old person can struggle with language, because for the most part, the parents in my area have been informed by the system that just with the right training and support and whatnot, that the kids will grow out of it and be perfectly normal. And so I
mm,
disabuse them of that forthwith, right? And then I do an analysis with them, kind of a narrative, like I'm talking right now about their child, and it's more of a monologue at that point, which I don't really like to do. But I explain it to them, like, this is going to feel like a monologue, and but at the end of it, you're going to feel something. And I want you to kind of stay with that because I describe their child's journey to high school as I would in an essay, right? I tell the story of the child as I've found it in the data and observation and work samples and stuff. And I say to them that this child has been failed by the system. It's been The system has failed to recognize them in its entirety. They don't know this child at all. And so here's what I've found. And here's what we're going to do about it. Right. And then I can speak of the child in terms of this mythic struggle of their system trying to work in the school system that is not only not recognizing them, but antagonizing them, working against their interests. And this history, I can interpret it from the standpoint of a child completely overwhelmed and not able to defend themselves against any of this, you know. And then I lay out, goals that are based in the data, based on the reality of things. And I let them know my teaching philosophy, my advocacy, where I am. Here's my telephone number. You can email me through this. You can, however you need to be supported. Here I am. I'm your child's advocate on campus. Yes, I get paid by the district, but oftentimes I am fighting the district on behalf of my students.
mm.
So I'm in that very odd position, but I am your child's number one advocate. And then when they need something, they can come to me and I can fight for them when they don't feel like it. And all of these kinds of things. And I've had parents cry, like, I've never heard this before. You've perfectly described my child that, we've never met or whatever. And so over the years, I've ended up with almost all of the autistic high schoolers on my roster. And I'm being called into other things and so on because of it. But it's not hard to do. It's not a mystery. It's not any of that. It's just, from within inside of it, I can see
Mhm.
it clearly because I was them, only
Mhm.
much worse off, right? And from that standpoint, defending Gestalt processing, right? Describing echo, describing recursivity, from a standpoint of this is perfectly normal. I
Yeah,
do it myself. This is how my brain thinks. And so then
yeah.
they're kind of reconnecting to their child, thinking, oh, I did not give birth to this freak of nature that I can understand. Here's this person describing things perfectly normally. And then at the end of it all, I have that script, 15 to 20 pages. And I said, everything that I've told you is in here. I want to give this to you. These are my notes, right? And you can refer to them, and they're perfectly harmonious with the IEP documents that we've written. And you know, because I tell, even when I was teaching college and so on, I say, just as I did for the GLP conference, I don't want you taking notes. I want you to listen. I want us to have a
Yeah.
conversation. I've written all this stuff down. It's yours for free. All of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Because I want that connection, and I teach the same way in the classroom. I've done the work ahead of time. I just want you to be here, have that relationship, listen, participate as much as you can in the way that you can, and you'll grow. You just
Hmm.
will, and they do. Um,
Yeah.
but the system doesn't understand how that works for me. It's
No,
just
and I was going to say that systems, so
right.
um certainly our system, and again, look, I draw on a lot of my experience for much younger children, so they're starting on their literacy journey. But I'm working with children who are starting school with no formal teaching and they're hyperlexic. They're reading, really complex words, language, um, and they start off by being taught um, the individual units, the phonemes, the sounds, the letter sound correspondence, the grapheme phoneme correspondence, and it just that is the system, but it doesn't make sense for that child.
Right. And I've met those, my first year in the district, I was in primary school,
Mm,
and there was a boy, a young African American boy, beautiful voice, um, perfect pitch, perfect prosody, um, like he was a news presenter, right? When he was reading, and the
mm,
pace was just gorgeous, right? No, no, no pauses, no anything. He just read aloud beautifully. And then you would pause him to say, okay, in this word here, what are the vowels and what are the consonants? And he looked at you like you were from Mars. Like, who the hell cares? Did you know hear me say this? Right. And I'm thinking of Leonard Cohen at that time, reading poetry on the radio and saying, why are you asking such stupid questions? Right? Just hear what I have to say, and then you would ask a question about, like, what is the story about? And he'd look at you the same way, like, are you daft, man? Why do you care about this? Can you not hear me read? Right. And of course, he was what we would call here functionally illiterate, like I was, right? Where you can read beautifully because you have this memory map. You've stored all of these sight words and you know how they sound and how they feel, probably because you are at church or you are watching telly or whatever, and you heard somebody that you really really liked the sound of and the pace of their voice, and so you matched it. And you sat there with your granny or your ma or whoever, and they were reading you, and you were absorbing all of this stuff, your dad, whoever, and so then you kind of match the sound to that picture of that word, and you put it all together over time. This child was in our fifth grade. Um, and because you could perform this, the student thought, or the system thought you were like gifted because you could read so beautifully. And on our weird scoring systems, right? They register this as like upper high school, right? Okay, what does it mean? I have no idea. Right? None whatsoever. It's not important. It was always important for me to sound like this, so I sound like this, right? What else do you
Hmm.
want? Right. And I love the honesty of the boy. He was in special day program with me because he had what the system calls emotionally or behavioral disorders, right? Because what would happen is if you started asking questions, if you broke him off of his rhythm, he'd get very cross with you and throw things, right? So we didn't do that, right? It was that simple. It's like, all
Mm.
right, if I ask you to read a paragraph, I'm not going to stop you in the middle. I'm going to hear you go, and then we'll do other things around that. And his behaviors went way down when we just became friends and I found out the things that he was interested in and I started building lessons around those things and we started adding some meanings and stuff like that and things calmed down, and I find, getting to know people and not really standing on ceremony and all that, formalities and stuff
Mm.
is kind of the key to what I do in classroom. And that's kind of why I say, this week I'm kind of at my limit in special ed because they can imagine like I am a peer. I have a different viewpoint. I have different ways of doing things, a different whole way of being that the system would want to extinguish. And so
Yeah.
it's very harmful to come into professional spaces when the people there wholly believe that not only are they an expert because they have an autistic sibling or child or whatever, but that they know best and I don't, right?
Mm.
That my experience in life as autistic as Gestalt processor is not relevant because it's not found in literature. It's not found in the science of reading and all of this stuff. And it does not matter what I've written or whatever. They have it in their mind, and that's that, right? And so I thought to myself, where can I be of the most benefit, right? And so I think within a year or two, when I finish all these qualifications on stuff, then I will go from having a cohort of 25 to having one of a minimum 180.
Wow.
Aye. So why not be ambitious about things,
Yeah. But just think about the impact that you can have on a wider group as well.
Aye, and I to that end, we're doing testing right now at school, the standardized testing for mid-year, and the students that have the plans that have, you can be pulled into a special, segregated supported setting. They have negotiated with their other teachers, their general ed teachers, to have kind of an emotional support bestie because they frame it that way. Like I co-regulate with this friend of mine really well, and that's the support I need in Dr. H's class. When in reality, the bestie wants to come to my class because it's a nice place to be, and they don't want to be in their own class or whatever. And it's not to criticize colleagues or anything, but
No,
it's
no.
just it's kind of affirming to me because it's the kind of room I wanted to create. When I became a
Mm.
classroom teacher. I wanted students to want to be there, and I didn't really conceive of the fact that they don't want to bring a friend or anything like that. But that's what we have.
But it's attunement. And I think
Aye,
that that's the greatest gift to, to create that. Creating connection enables growth, enables learning, enables language development. The small people that I see that come in that get really that perhaps in other situations have been overwhelmed, have felt pressure, have not somebody hasn't thought about their sensory preferences, so have seen behavior as opposed to actually they like the room dark, so we set it
aye,
up, and they're great excitement arriving and actual not wanting to leave. So like you, it feels, yeah, we're getting it right with we're thinking about those
aye.
children.
And that kind of loops back to the kind of piece that got me to Substack in the first place, where
Mm.
I wrote a paper about alexithymia and classroom behavior.
Mm.
And it was from the premise of somebody that I met, a behaviorist, who was trying to extinguish an autistic kid's behavior that they found problematic, but without knowing the child very well. And I'm meeting the child for the first time as well and getting to know them. And the behavior that I saw, I also saw in a friend who was not in the same class. And so they were kind of attuned. And this alexithymia, they just kind of absorbed this behavior, which the behaviorist thought was wrong. And so I asked her, says um, have you heard of alexithymia? Because I think that might be the cause of, the root of what's going on here. And she had no idea what I was talking about. Right. And so in my mind, me being me, out comes this academic paper. And I shopped it around and nobody wanted it. And so that was the first real big thing that I said, okay, well, I want to put this out there. Where am I going to put it? I'm a poor teacher and I have no money to do, 1,000 or, $1,500 to do open access or whatever. But I want to put it somewhere. And that's when I found Substack. And so that was like the first piece. And there have been others. And I kind of name it like, I'm putting this here because nobody wants it. Right. But I think it should be available to everyone. The about a week ago, maybe 10 days ago, to my absolute surprise, a paper that I wrote was accepted to a journal. Me quite some time to figure out how to get it, the revisions that they requested in through their online system was terrible, but just the fact that I got accepted was like, wow. And it was a GLP paper and it was auto theory and all of this stuff.
Mm.
And so I was kind of surprised by that, like, oh wow.
Well,
Um,
I have to
but
say, reading your Substack, Jamie, I'm not in the slightest bit surprised, and I think what you offer to the community, because that's it. It's about community, and you're exceptionally generous with sharing your thoughts. And I know, well, from our conversations, you perhaps don't see it like that, but for someone like myself, I find it really, really professionally generous.
oh, well, thank you. I think what I've enjoyed about Substack, the platform,
Mm,
I acknowledge that there are problems, with any kind of capitalist enterprise and so on, and that, people would disagree with people being on there and all that stuff. I acknowledge that, but I was reading for revision. I was reading the paper. I wrote it in August, last August, and I was thinking to myself, do I really think this anymore? Right? Because I don't know. And so they were asking for very technical, kinds of things, and whoever these anonymous reviewers were, I would use Sukareva in and just assume everybody knew who I was talking about. And apparently the reviewers had no idea who I was talking about. And so I had to put some context around, the name drop there. And then my brain wandered elsewhere. And so part of that revision from the publisher was, I did not name like, the line number and the page number where I had inserted stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, man, I've replaced the entire paragraph because I didn't like it. Right. So I'll highlight the whole paragraph and I'll put reviewers' notes and stuff outside of the scope of what they've asked for. And so that's been reviewed and so on. But I think what I like is I can do things every day. I can park these gestalts every day. I can go back to them. I can go back to that, 2022 alexithymia thing and say, oh
mm,
yeah, I thought this and, let me pull some stuff out. And it makes a little bit more sense how I'm thinking about it today, right? And that's how recursivity works. That's how meaning time works, where for us, autistic people, Gestalt processors, we are not in Chronos time, we're in Kairos time. And so meaning goes back and forth across time. Um, Stuff that I'm experiencing now as an adult help what happened when I was 22 make more sense, if that makes sense.
yeah.
And so it's not that like we're rewriting history or whatever, but it's just adding layers of meaning, right? And I try to kind of illustrate that in a piece coming up next week about
Mm,
recursivity and meaning time and how that works, and so it hopefully it makes sense to people who are coming from the outside, who are in relationship, professional or personal with a Gestalt processor, I don't quite understand things like Kairos time and the quality world picture and choice theory and recursivity and field-based, relationship-based stuff. So I think this last week or two and the week coming, the stuff that I've already written is around that kind of explanatory, not from a
Yeah.
deficit standpoint, but
No.
from epistemology, from positive ontology to say this is perfectly normal, right? And like this morning's piece, not only is it perfectly normal, it's old. Humanity was like this, right?
Hmm.
And there was a time where a different way of organizing things began to take shape and power. That's the analytics, right? So they're the new thing. We might be 100,000 years old, 200,000 years old as Gestalt processors. They might be 5,000 years old, right? But they have power, so they call the shots or whatever. But I've written this kind of arc, kind of semi-fictional arc, in a few different ways over a few different subjects. But it's kind of the theme of there was a time before this, then there is this
Hmm.
time, there will be a time after this. And that's kind of how helps me get by in America with politics and stuff. There was a time before this madness, and there'll be a time after, and that
Yeah.
keeps me a bit hopeful. But I think this has been a heavy couple of weeks, writing things
Yeah.
out, and um, so I'm trying not to be as defensive, with the
Yeah. Yeah.
naysayers and all that stuff, and just kind of not ignore them, but
Just move
discover.
on.
I just move on. Like, no, this is
Mm.
us. We can define ourselves. Thank you very much. And we'll be on
Yeah.
our way.
Yeah. Well, I'm really looking forward to this week's Substack writings. So thank you so much, Jamie. We need to stop there because we've had a really super duper session today. Um,
Aye,
but I really enjoyed it. Thank you. And I will look forward to seeing you next week.
aye. It's always a pleasure, and I always look forward to Saturday mornings.
Me too. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye bye.